Good evening, and a warm welcome to all our viewers in Scotland and around the world. This is Scotland at 7, and my name is Janine McNair. Tonight we will begin with the Ukraine update, and this is day 295 of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. On this day, Volodymyr Zelensky has called on G7 leaders to back a peace solution that would start with Russia withdrawing troops from Ukraine beginning this Christmas. There is no calm on the front line, he added in an evening video address. The Ukrainian military said it shot down 13 Iranian-made drones over Kyiv and the surrounding region on Wednesday in Russia's first major drone attack on the capital in weeks. The strikes damaged 5 buildings, and authorities described the assault as a continuation of Russia's energy terror against the country. Russian drone strikes on Kyiv and the region around the Ukrainian capital on Wednesday did not damage any energy facilities, the national power grid operator Ukrenergo said. The Washington Post is reporting that the US is planning to send electronic equipment that converts unguided aerial munitions into smart bombs, allowing a high degree of accurate targeting. Canada has said it will revoke a sanctions waiver that allowed turbines for Nord Stream 1, Russia's biggest gas pipeline to Europe, to be repaired in Montreal and returned to Germany. The war in Ukraine will continue for some time going forward, the White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby has predicted. Kirby said the scale of the ongoing violence tempered hopes for an imminent end to hostilities. Russia is facing a critical shortage of artillery shells, and Moscow's ability to conduct ground operations in Ukraine is rapidly diminishing as a result. Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the UK Chief of Defence Staff, has said. A US national who was arrested by pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine in the summer has now been released as part of a prisoner exchange with Ukraine, the head of Ukraine's presidential administration, Andriy Yermak, said. Now, this evening, we're going to discuss some news items as usual, but we're also going to have a strong focus on the Scottish Government budget. So this evening I would like to welcome our guest, William Duguid. William Duguid, good. Hello, William.
Hello, nice to see you, Janine, and welcome to, this is your second edition of the show.
It is, yes. So I'm still fairly new. I believe that you head up the Yes organisation in Perth. Is that correct, William?
Well, I'm very prominent in the Yes Hub. Yes, Perth City, I just do communications for, and other people run that. So we're quite an interesting and strong team there. So I play my part in that.
That's good to hear. So this evening, we're going to talk through the stories of the day after we have discussed the budget, which just came out this afternoon. So the first point that we're going to discuss about the budget is that it was actually delayed, and it should have started roughly about 2:30 this afternoon, but there was a delay which the presiding officer called. So I'm just going to read that through now. So the start of the budget statement was delayed by 40 minutes in total when the presiding officer suspended the meeting of the Parliament, when opposition members complained that details of the tax changes had been leaked to the BBC. Tory MSPs Murdo Fraser and Stephen Kerr and Labour MSP Neil Bibby all raised points of order about the BBC announcing the tax changes on their website before they had been announced in Parliament. When Parliament resumed, presiding officer Alison Johnston said she had spoken to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, and had been assured that the apparent leak had not come from the Scottish Government. William, I'd like to ask you if you were aware of that delay this afternoon and maybe what you made of it, because it seemed a little surprising that when something was scheduled like that it would then have been delayed by 40 minutes, which is quite a substantial amount of time for all the broadcasting and taking into account the public, which would be waiting eagerly to see the budget at 2:30. Did you have any comments on that?
Well, troublesome for the broadcasters, and not least Broadcasting Scotland, because all your schedules just go to pieces. I imagine that the 40 minutes was the period of time during which the presiding officer carried out her initial investigations into what happened. You don't really want budget details leaking, that's absolutely right. And the question is, how did they become leaked, and how much do you want to make of it? Obviously, the First Minister and John Swinney also have said it wasn't us. It could have been a member of another party who had been given, I gather, an embargoed copy of some of the things that were in the budget, who leaked it to the BBC. I'm not sure if you can blame the BBC for broadcasting it when they got the scoop, because there's a long history, certainly with Westminster, of things being leaked in budgets. George Osborne's entire 2013 budget was leaked to the Evening Standard. And well before that, back when it really was a hanging offence to leak details, the Chancellor Hugh Dalton in 1947 had to resign because he had a somewhat indiscreet conversation with a journalist from the Star on his way to the House of Lords, where they were holding the budget because the Houses of Parliament had been bombed in the war and it still hadn't got back to normal. And somehow this managed to get published before he started speaking. And despite the opposition being actually quite nice about it, far nicer than the opposition have been today in Holyrood, he had to resign the next day. So yes, you do want to get to the bottom of leaks because they shouldn't happen. I think, in my view, and this is probably a minority view, in the scheme of things, it really doesn't happen. It doesn't matter very much. But everything in this Parliament is politicised, and everything that the BBC has to do with is politicised at the moment. So clearly, that's the storm in a teacup you get, and that's the inconvenience the broadcasters have to suffer.
Right, William. It's great to see that you've clearly done your homework on this matter and you're able to tell us stories, not stories, but facts about incidents that happened in previous budgets, even going back to the 1940s. That's really quite impressive. And I'm actually very glad to hear that it's not the first time that had happened. It makes it feel like quite not as potentially sinister or whatever may be behind it or whoever is behind it. We don't know, but it's just in some way comforting to know that it's not the first time this has happened.
I'm sure we will find out who it was in due course. We'll see.
And as you said, I mean, today it was not taken lightly, and it was not treated as a kind of joint problem, I felt, but rather something that the opposition could use to try to in some way verbally attack the Deputy First Minister himself. They kind of put the onus on him to try to accuse him of certain actions when he didn't really apparently seem to know too much himself at that time. So as you said, it's so important to get to the bottom of it. I'm sure not least for the Deputy First Minister and the First Minister themselves.
I'm sure that's right. But I think in a cost of living crisis, the man or woman in the street does not really care about this. And to an extent, as so many things are in both the parliaments right now, it's a piece of pantomime. I don't want to belittle it because really it shouldn't happen, but it'll be yesterday's fish and chip wrappers, I should think, quite soon.
Right. Well, that's it's good to kind of conclude the issue on a humorous note there. So moving on to the actual budget itself, we're going to talk about that. We'll go through some of the main points that came up, and we will try to structure a little bit, focusing on the order of items that John Swinney presented today. So first, he gave some background on the situation, the current economic situation affecting Scotland, particularly because of our situation within the UK. And there were some quite devastating statistics, which we probably already know ourselves, but just to hear them all presented in front of us. I mean, for example, the fact that within the G20, the UK is now only is bottom of the G20 with the exception of Russia. And this situation is only going to continue to decline. So John Swinney gave some interesting background at the beginning to kind of set up how difficult it was at this time to produce a budget which can help mitigate the circumstances that Scotland finds itself in. And he went into some detail about that. I don't know if you saw that first part. Would you like to say anything about that to start off with?
Well, the Scottish Government is always seemingly in the position of mitigating what the UK government does. I think it's now becoming apparent, and we may have seen some signs of this in Westminster just a couple of weeks ago, that the Liz Truss mini budget, or call it what you will, in collaboration with Kwasi Kwarteng, really did quite a lot of damage to public finances in the UK. And that does have its knock-on effects on Scotland. It means it takes the Scottish Government longer to deliver on its agenda because it's scrabbling around for money. It means that they need to look again at public sector reform to try and sort of just slice back the costs there. It constrains their their capital spending, and it really makes it quite difficult for them to plan ahead really much further than next year. One of the things that struck me is, and this is often called out by the opposition, that the Scottish Government has an underspend, and it took into this year's monies an underspend of £450 million. But in looking at next year, it's looking at absolutely no underspend at all, basically everything being used up, everything accounted for. And that just shows you how tight the finances are and how bad the economic situation is. And of course, the amount of things we can do to alleviate that are pretty well limited. It's like playing a piano with boxing gloves with the powers we've actually got. So I don't envy John Swinney at all the task that he had. And I think in the circumstances, he's probably made a reasonably good fist of it, but we will come to that.
Yes, he did emphasise that this was the first year, certainly over recent years, that he and his team had to try to deal with a budget under the circumstances of an extremely rising inflation.
We don't know how long inflation will go on, and we're talking about interest rate rises and how that impacts on it later on. There are differing views about how inflation will go. Of course, when government ministers talk about pay increases, they always say they're fueling inflation. That may or may not be true, because a lot of the inflation may be as the result of external sources, not least to do with the war in Ukraine. Admittedly, because of the state of the economy and because of Brexit as well, a lot of these adverse impacts have been a bit harsher in the UK than they have elsewhere. So you have to deal with that as well. But on what is, I would say, an absolutely fixed budget, because technically it isn't, but a very limited budget, to be dealing with high inflation is a big problem. And you have seen that in the Scottish Government's challenge in meeting the pay demands of some of the unions. And again, they've done better than the UK government because they're at least having the dialogue. But it does make life very, very difficult for them.
Yes, yes, it certainly does. And another thing pointed out today was that there have been requests by John Swinney and his Welsh counterpart, requests made to the UK Chancellor, to the UK government, to try to help with the increasing inflation costs, with the effect of Brexit, with the effect of the war in Ukraine. But these requests have unfortunately been so far ignored. And that's an important thing as well to take into account, just the level of challenge that the Scottish Government have been under, and producing this budget today is really quite impressive that they've been able to do this under such circumstances. So if we go on now to think about the structure of the budget itself, it seems that there are three main areas which are emphasised. One is child poverty, trying to abate and trying to continue to reduce child poverty in Scotland, yes. And the second one was about the net zero emissions, which is another thing outlined and stressed by the Scottish Government over the last few years, especially since COP26 and especially since their new agreement and their new deal with the Greens. The third aspect of the budget was public services. So that really covers so many areas. So we can start by talking a little bit, if you like, about the intentions to alleviate child poverty in today's budget. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So would you like to say something about that?
Well, I think that the Scottish Government is already making inroads into child poverty through the child payment, and that certainly goes on. The other thing that's of interest is that they have ensured that benefits go up in line with inflation, and that also impacts on families as well. There's only so much, of course, that they can do because it's an ongoing issue, and a complex issue as well, because child poverty exists for so many different reasons and is so intractable. But I think what we're seeing in the budget pretty well is an attempt at redistributing wealth from the very richest, the highest earning, to the poorest, and to try and channel that into payments and services that will help bring children and families out of poverty. And that's a laudable aim. Whether it will succeed, because raising the top rate of tax, particularly in a Scottish situation, is not necessarily going to give you the result that you expect, because there are so many things that people can do to get round it, not least pay themselves with dividends, which go to Westminster. And I don't think they would go quite so far as the famous Roddy Dunlop claim that he would be off to Berwick upon Tweed if he was being taxed more here than in England. But it's a difficult business, because if you don't have control of all the levers, you risk unforeseen consequences. So again, I think it's pretty much as steady as she goes, but I do like the redistribution, and I think that will help with that aim of alleviating child poverty.
Yeah, I think we can point out as well the main figure with that, and the fact that they've got the Scottish Child Payment, which has been increased to £25 per week. I think it was pointed out that over a short space of only a few months, that really has gone up significantly, something like 250%, if I get my figures correct. So I think it began at £10 per week. It went up to £20.
You're good with the arithmetic there.
It went up to £20 per week, and then just recently, with this part of this budget programme, it's gone up to £25, or it's going up. Yes, so it's going to be maintained. So that's pretty essential, for mothers, for women in Scotland, who are often the primary responsible party for making sure that their children are properly fed and clothed. So it's
And
it's something
it
that
doesn't have a
brings home.
counterpart in England. Yeah,
No,
it
exactly.
doesn't have a counterpart in England. They're just left to get on with it in England. So I think it is a good thing. And I do think it resonates with voters as well as an indication of what Scotland could do if it were doing things for itself. So, yeah, top marks for that. And let's just hope that the financial situation is alleviated sufficiently that they can do a wee bit more as time goes on. Because I know that they're looking, John Swinney particularly, is looking further ahead. And there's still lots and lots of problems to come because of all the constraints we're seeing and because of the alarming nature of the financial situation.
Right, thanks, William. I'm going to read out a few statistics now, not to fill the whole programme, but to add to give you a few of the statistics from today's budget. So around £1 billion investment will be made into high quality early learning and childcare provision, with a further 22 million invested in holiday food provision and expanding support for school-aged childcare. £50 million will be made available for the whole family wellbeing programme for preventative coordinated family support, and a further £30 million to keep the promise to care experienced children and young people, that is the children and young people who have the responsibility of caring perhaps for other siblings or for parents. Furthermore, there's £80 million capital funding to support the expansion of free school meals. And many of the other measures regarding public services and also for universities and colleges, for example, the £45 million increase in resource funding to universities and colleges, are ultimately also geared towards child poverty in terms of child future, having some aspirations and some real possibilities for future development. So, yes, I mean, in some ways, the three parts are all integrated: child poverty, the net zero, and the public services. So we could perhaps go on now to talk about the net zero targets. Yeah. So I think one of the main things that was mentioned also in the after questions was referring to the transport. So this is something obviously that the Greens have also pushed for, and there's been a measure to reduce peak train fares. Don't know if you caught that one, but they're going to actually eliminate them, aren't they? They're going to make the peak train fares the same price as any time of the day train fares, correct?
Yeah, this is what's called the Fair Fares Review, isn't it? And
Fair
they put
fares.
15
You're
million
right.
into
Yes.
it to
Yes.
encourage people to use public transport. And the other side of the whole net zero thing is the decarbonising of transport. And they've begun to make some significant moves towards that. You've probably got the listing of them, but I can mention them as and when. But it's interesting that they really have fixed on this as one of the key things, because it does illustrate that you can't leave aside the fundamentals, because net zero is a fundamental. And it's only about 8 days ago since the Climate Change Committee pulled the Scottish Government up to a great extent on how it was getting on with the net zero. And in particular, one of the things was the decarbonising of transport. So this is the response. And I think it's a fairly innovative and a potentially very useful one.
Well, Ross Greer, MSP, the Scottish Greens finance spokesperson, said, quote, "I'm delighted that we've been able to deliver this long-standing green policy, one which will save rail users a huge amount of money during the cost of living crisis and which will help Scotland meet its climate ambitions." The second point about that is that there's also the free bus travel scheme. So this is adding, if you like, to options for travellers. It's not completely, it's not making train travel completely free for certain travellers, but it is going in the right direction, I could say. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's an assault on various fronts on the problem. Um, Encouraging rail travel, maintaining free bus travel for far greater numbers than you see elsewhere in the UK, putting money into the rail infrastructure, because there's no point in trying to attract people onto the trains with fares if the rail infrastructure is falling apart. And I think Scotland's rail infrastructure does need a fair amount of work on it. So I think it was 1.4 billion they put into that. They put 60 million into electric vehicle charging infrastructure, a bugbear of a recent BBC Scotland documentary, if I'm not mistaken, perhaps in the Disclosure series. And I think that is the future. We need to get about, but we need to get about in a sustainable way. And I think there have been some fairly innovative things that have been done with that today.
Well, as I said before, the Green Party are delighted with the budget. They actually said in a press statement that no peak fares, free bus travel for people under 22, and record new investment for walking, wheeling, and cycling are just some of the reasons why this is the greenest budget in Scotland's history. That's quite a statement, isn't it?
Well, the right to keep the Greens on side. We should always keep our Greens on side. I think that's Ross Greer knows is what he's talking about there, and he's recognised that this is a collaborative government, and we're just beginning now to see the results of that, and let's see more of it in future years, I think.
I hope so. All right, William. Now, after John Swinney delivered his budget statement, there were some questions, of course, and one of the questions I noticed was the recurring question by more than one questioner about the A9 road and the intention to make that road completely dual carriageway. And would you like to make any comments about that particular point?
Well, the A9 dualling is a big issue, and they're supposed to achieve it fully by 2025. And this is against the background, as we said earlier, of the capital budget being constrained by the economic situation. So I don't know whether that is going to be an extended thing. I know it's been very controversial of late because there have been road accidents and deaths recently that have caught the public attention. To a certain extent, you can only do it as fast as you can do it, and road accidents are ultimately caused by drivers. You can make conditions easier for drivers, but ultimately it is up to drivers. I hope that they are able to move ahead at the timetable they were expecting to, because I think if we can nail the problem of the A9, and it has been a problem for many, many years, I think that will make a considerable difference.
Yes, absolutely. As you said, because of the limitations, then the Scottish Government have been faced with a very difficult set of choices, which is something they've emphasised again and again. And John Swinney came back to that when people questioned him about why he didn't spend more on that particular issue, or even on other ones such as payment for social care staff. Well, John Swinney explained again that obviously with the limitation of the money, then it was not possible to do more about that right now. But they're certainly making more stretches of the A9 are gradually becoming dual, aren't they? So we're certainly going in the right direction with that. Yeah.
But sure.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah. So, yes, one thing we haven't discussed so far is about the actual funding of this budget and about the tax rates which are going to change.
I touched on it, but didn't go into detail. Yes.
So that's so important for many people. So it would be good to explain a little bit what's happening with that. I believe it affects both the threshold for the highest income earners and perhaps for the second highest group. And it also affects the rate, which is 1 pence in the pound, an increase of 1 pence in the pound more for the higher payers, the higher earners.
Yeah. People above £43,666 income per year are going to see an increase in that tax band to 42%, which will be higher than, I think, the 41% that will be levied at Westminster. And the people earning above 125,000, and that's a band that's reduced from 150,000, but which is exactly what Westminster is doing with the UK tax system. They, I think, will be paying 47p as against 45p. So the claim is going to be made, particularly by Tories, that it's far more expensive for them in Scotland than it is in England. And that may well be true. But at the same time, if you take things in the round for lower taxpayers, you're probably slightly better off in Scotland. The lower tax thresholds and rates have not been touched. Now, of course, not changing the thresholds is in itself a kind of drag. If more of your pay is, it's not going up in line with inflation, basically, and of course it isn't. But nevertheless, I think that the lower taxpayers are being reasonably well protected. And that's quite important. The other side, of course, to the whole question of tax is not so much what you pay, but what you get for it. And I think Scottish taxpayers get a reasonably good deal for their money because they get free prescriptions, they get free tuition, they get things like the Scottish child payment. And I think nobody should be tempted to slip over the border to Berwick-on-Tweed and see how you get on there. I think that's a load of noise. We will hear a lot of it. Undoubtedly we will. But I think the majority of people in Scotland are in sympathy with the proposition that the people who are earning more should pay more, and that the burden of getting us out of the financial mess we're in should be on the shoulders of those best able to bear it. That is something that pretty much seems to have been forgotten at Westminster very often.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that before issuing the budget, they also took some independent reports, for example, from a team at Glasgow University, and it was generally favourable to this idea of increasing slightly for the higher earners. That was a report by Anton Muscatelli at the University of Glasgow, George Brewer, I think, and a third person. So, as you say, there seems to be a lot of support for this idea of increasing taxes where it can be safely done without affecting the actual poverty rates.
Let's see what happens when the next set of polls comes out.
Yes, yeah. And of course, all of this is resulting in the extra £1 billion, which has been made available for the NHS in Scotland.
Hugely important, this. Protecting the NHS and trying to help the NHS to recover. And again, doing it on a limited budget when it seems that the UK government is trying to push the NHS down the road towards selling it off as the way out of the financial issues they're in. You can't fix the structural problems in the NHS that are caused by things like Brexit-related staff shortages, but this £1 billion may prevent them getting worse and may just allow the NHS steadily just to get its stability back and to start to improve again. It is, I think, for many individuals still highly reliable. It's just you always hear about the cases where things go wrong, and you always hear the statistics, selectively quoted, I might add, that suggest that things are going to hell in a handcart, whereas, in fact, the Scottish Government is dealing with a bad situation created by a central funding issue over which they have little control, really fairly well. And I think it's a big, big plank in this budget that they are trying to get the NHS Scotland back on an even keel, and I applaud it.
Yes, thanks, William. And of course, we've seen another issue very much related to that today, with the fact that the nurses in England, in the English NHS, are on strike today, whereas in Scotland we've been able to avoid that because of the action of the Scottish Government again.
Well, the strike action was paused, that's correct. I have to say, I think that the GMB health workers have rejected the pay offer that the others have brought in, but you may be reporting on that in a wee minute anyway. So
yes.
I won't go in. I won't put the cart before the horse.
No, all right, absolutely. It was just where I was thinking about this 1 billion that had been allocated and maybe some of the effects of that. Moving on now to some other stories of today. The Bank of England raises interest rates to 3.5%. Mortgage payers are bracing for higher borrowing costs after the Bank of England pushed up its base rate by 0.5 percentage points to 3.5%, despite saying inflation has peaked and the UK is about to enter a prolonged recession. The bank hiked interest rates today for the 9th time in a year to the highest level in 14 years, but told borrowers to prepare for fresh increases in the new year. Members of the bank's Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, voted to increase the cost of borrowing after the Consumer Prices Index in November showed annual inflation of 10.7%. Governor Andrew Bailey said a fall in CPI from 11.1% in October represented the first glimmer that inflation had begun to ease, and he expected a rapid fall, probably from the late spring onwards. His comments, which appeared to show further rate rises could peak below forecasts of 4.5% by the end of next year, sent the pound tumbling against the dollar by 2 cents. Mr. Bailey forecast skill shortages would push wages higher and prevent inflation falling towards the bank's 2% target as fast as he had hoped. Debt charity Step Change warned that higher borrowing costs would plunge more people into debt and called on lenders to show restraint before calling in loans. Do you have any comments on this news item, William?
Well, it's not good news. You could say, well, things aren't going to be as bad as we thought they were going to be. But I think it's unavoidable news. Other countries are raising their interest rates as well. So in order to keep paid and not put the pound under more pressure than it clearly already is, we pretty much need to follow suit. But the impact on individual households at a time when so much is hitting them is undeniable. And I think it's not absolutely clear what the longer term movement on interest rates will be, because typically the forecasts turn out to be wrong because they're stymied by events elsewhere. And it was interesting that there was a split in the Monetary Committee about today's rise. 6 of them supported it, 2 of them wanted no change, and 1 of them wanted to go even higher. Meanwhile, the Lib Dems, quite rightly, their spokesperson is talking about it being the nightmare before Christmas. It may seem like a nightmare scenario right now. I think we need to be looking at not just restraint, but actually legislated for a temporary ban on things like house repossessions and evictions in England, as they are currently prevented in Scotland. And maybe over time, because a lot of people have been brought into mortgages higher than once would have been the case and gone into them at a low level, and suddenly the interest rate has trebled or quadrupled, then I think we need some sort of long-term strategy for getting households out of that financial situation, whether you call it a mortgage rescue fund or whether you just call it some form of realignment of how mortgages are calculated. And I don't see too much of that. There's too much evidence of just people being left to get on with it. And eventually the money just runs out, and a lot of households are beginning to experience that.
Well, thanks for your insightful comments about that, William. You went into a lot of detail. That was very useful. I'm going to go on to the next story now. Nurses on strike in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Nurses will start striking for longer at more places and will disrupt more NHS services from next month unless the UK government increases its pay offer, hospital bosses have warned. Tens of thousands of outpatient appointments and non-urgent operations were cancelled today as nurses across England, Wales and Northern Ireland went on strike over pay. A second 12-hour stoppage is due next Tuesday at dozens of hospitals, mental health units and specialist care providers such as children's hospitals. NHS Employers, which represents all health trusts in England on staff's terms and conditions, has told its members that the Royal College of Nursing is likely to expand and intensify its planned campaign of strikes unless ministers agree to negotiate a new pay deal. The Royal College of Nursing called members out on strike today at only half the number of trusts at which a majority of nurses in its recent UK-wide strike ballot voted to stop work. Ruth May, England's chief nursing officer and a senior figure at NHS England, made it clear on Thursday that she wanted ministers to urgently strike a deal with the RCN, the Royal College of Nurses, to end the strikes. In Scotland, NHS strikes were called off when Unite and Unison members voted to accept the Scottish Government pay deal. The RCN's Scottish members are currently voting on whether to accept the Scottish Government deal. However, GMB ambulance service members have today voted to reject the Scottish Government's offer. Well, William, back to you again. I don't know if you knew about the ambulance situation with the GMB.
Yes. I knew about that. It's okay. Well, we thought we were doing quite well with the other unions accepting the offer, which is again probably pretty well as good as the Scottish Government can offer. It's a 7.5% average offer, but the rates of increase are greater for the lower paid. So some of them get up to 11%, but of course not everybody. And yes, the GMB have rejected it. Now, they have left the door open for discussion. They've done it in a slightly snarky way that, let's make Hamza Yousaf live up to his promise to speak. But, the Scottish Government is engaging with the unions on this and other matters. And this is a complete contrast with what's happening in the UK, in England. So I think they have left the door open for Hamza Yousaf to have words with them before Christmas. And I remain reasonably optimistic that some form of settlement will be reached. The RCN, I hope, and I know they're still balloting, and I was very pleased that they suspended the strike action in Scotland this week and cited the Scottish Government's positive attitude to negotiation as one of the things that mattered. And so hopefully they will accept the offer. But in any event, there's a discussion going on, and we're not just going down the slippery slope here. We're doing our best to get out of this problem and give everybody, if not what they want, something they can live with until we can give them what we want. And I think that's the sort of attitude, one of respect, which I think is lacking in the Westminster government's attitude to the health workers. Respect is important, and I think that remains present on both sides, and long may that continue.
Thanks, William. On to our next story now. The UK government ministers have unlawfully turned their back on former BBC journalists whose lives are at risk from the Taliban by refusing to relocate them from Afghanistan to the UK, the High Court has heard. 8 Afghan journalists who worked in high-profile roles for the BBC and other media agencies in the country from which British troops withdrew last year are challenging the decision to deny them UK visas. Adam Straw, KC, acting for the claimants at a hearing in London today, said they and other families were at high risk of being killed because of their work, which supported the UK government. Mr. Straw said, despite assurances by the then Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab that journalists would be protected, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace and Home Secretary Suella Braverman have turned their back on the claimants. Mr. Straw told the court that Wallace had initially failed to provide reasons for the rejection of the claimants' applications under the Afghan Relocations and Assistance Policy, which was in itself unlawful as it made it impossible to challenge the grounds. The claimants worked for the BBC World Service, which receives around £100 million funding a year from the Foreign Office. He added that the Taliban considered the BBC to be part of the UK government and that some of the journalists worked for other government projects, including one who presented Afghan Women's Hour. Well, William, I don't know if you've been following this about these journalists and this very difficult situation of being stranded by the looks of it in Afghanistan and not being given UK visas to come to safety after all that they have already done.
Yeah, it's become a point of law, although it was a promise made by Dominic Raab, who stepped off his sun lounger to make that promise, and it's not a good look in the eyes of the world. The government lawyers will contend that the Taliban's perception is irrelevant. So even if the Taliban think that the journalists were working for the government, they weren't. And they'll say similar about the fact it's the World Service, which we pretty well all know is an arm of the Foreign Office. But the letter of the law is not what matters to me here. A promise was made, and the letter of the law and a sort of unwillingness to fulfill promises should not trump basic humanity. It's not just the claimants in this case today, but their families that are at risk. And the whole Afghanistan mess, which was brought on by the Western powers, precipitate withdrawal, is something that these people are having to pick up the pieces for. Morally, our government and other Western governments need to face up to the consequences of their actions, and they need to show a bit of respect and not be mean-minded about it and not expose people to harm as a result of what they've done. So, another depressing episode in the chapter of how the UK government deals with people going back on its word. Not impressed at all.
Yes, thanks, William. I'm going to move on now to the final story of this evening. It's about the Scottish Government winter heating payments. Social Security Minister Ben McPherson gave evidence to the Scottish Parliament's Social Justice and Social Security Committee on regulations to introduce a new winter benefit today. Subject to parliamentary approval, winter heating payment will provide around 400,000 people in receipt of certain low-income benefits with a reliable £50 annual payment to help with their heating expenses every winter. This will total around £20 million per year. These payments will be made from February 2023. Winter heating payment will replace the UK government's cold weather payment scheme in Scotland and help more people with their bills. Cold weather payment is unpredictable and only triggers a £25 payment when temperatures fall below 0 degrees Celsius on average for 7 days in a row at certain weather stations. Social Security Minister Ben McPherson said, quote, Winter heating payment will replace cold weather payments with a reliable annual payment of £50, which will be made automatically to around 400,000 eligible people in Scotland this winter. This will help more people than the cold weather payments of £25, which on average have supported around 185,000 people in recent years. Cold weather payments have been unpredictable over the years because they are dependent on sustained cold weather to trigger a payment. Instead, our new winter heating payment will break the link with weather dependency and help those in need, wherever they live in Scotland and whatever the weather is like in their area. Winter heating payment is the 13th benefit to be introduced by the Scottish Government, and it will be delivered by Social Security Scotland. An individual may be eligible to receive winter heating payment if they are in receipt of any of the following: pension credit, income support, income-based job seekers allowance, income-related employment and support allowance, universal credit, and support for mortgage interest. William, I think this story is particularly pertinent this evening when we're probably in about day 6 now of sub-zero temperatures here in Glasgow, and many other parts are even worse in other parts of Scotland.
Yes, ironically, perhaps the current cold snap that we were in probably would have triggered that half-size cold weather payment that was previously paid by the DWP. But it's absolutely right that there shouldn't be that contingency, because a 5-day or a 6-day cold snap can be just as enervating as a 7-day or more. Break the link with the weather. That's the really important thing about this. It's a more generous payment, and one on which the recipients can rely. And that, I think, is the kind of character of the Scottish Government's approach to taking over gradually all the various welfare benefits. I think it's also worth mentioning, to bring things back round to today's budget, the size of the Fuel Insecurity Fund has also been doubled, and it's been done by redirecting the £20 million that was originally earmarked for an independence referendum. That doesn't mean there isn't going to be some sort of democratic event, and that will be accounted for when it comes round to it. But after having to put up with their opponents, their political opponents, going on about what will you do with that 20 million, isn't it a disgrace, they've actually found a very good use for it. And I think, yes, that is particularly pertinent in the cold snap that we're in.
Thanks, William. I think that's a great point to end on, that this sacrifice, if you like, of the £20 million, which is not going to affect presumably any actions that the government are going to take, but this money is being put to such good and direct use for the people of Scotland. And I absolutely agree that it should not be a matter of 6 days or 2 days or 1 day of cold spell. Absolutely agree with you there. So that brings us to the end of our broadcast for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. Good night, and thank you for watching. But before I say good night, I'll call over to William. And William, thank you very much for being our special guest tonight. It's been very enlightening, very interesting to hear your take, your perspective on all of the stories, especially today's budget.
Yes, and thank you. And remember, you never know how good a budget is until about 2 days after. So you'll find out all the real stuff in the time to come. But thank you for having me tonight, and it's been very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks again, William. Good night, everybody, and thank you for watching this evening.